Podcasting for Business, episode 11, getting better and better. Ronsley, how are you doing, my friend?
Amazing, amazing. I feel like these getting ready for these sessions every week gets easier and easier, and I want to say that we have better and better, but I don't think it's better and better. I think we get different guests. So I'm excited to talk with Liza today, and I'm excited to see how this show turns out.
It's going to be great. And if this is your first time joining us on the Podcasting for Business show, we show you how to get more listeners, more clients, and more credibility for you and your business, all from a podcast. Now, if you've got a story about your business journey or how a podcast has helped or hindered that business journey, we would love to feature you on the show. So you can send Ronsley or myself a DM, or you can drop a comment and we'll bring you on the show to talk more about some of the things that you have been able to do or not do to help you move forward. The way we're going to structure it today, we have a very special guest, Liza Florida, who's an incredible woman doing some amazing things. We're going to talk to her about her journey, biggest lessons along the way that you can use to be inspired to make those moves yourself. I'm going to share our big mistake, and the big mistake for this one is something that Ronsley will certainly tell you I am so passionate about, maybe more than anything else, and that's being underprepared for your interview. It very much frustrates me when you appear on someone's show and they're not prepared. So we're going to make sure you have a plan to always be perfectly prepared so you can have an amazing relationship with the person you're interviewing. And the tactic that Ronsley is going to share are the 7 stages to publishing your podcast episode so you can streamline your process to get your episode out more effectively. Before we begin, if there's something that lands for you, drop us a comment to let us know what resonated the most. Give us a like, a love heart, a thumbs up, whatever it is, so we can beat the Facebook and all the other social media algorithms, because we're appearing on a whole bunch of platforms at the moment. If you want a copy of our 10 biggest mistakes, go to mistakes.wearepodcast.com or just comment mistakes below and the team will send you out a link to that free PDF. It's got the 10 biggest mistakes that business owners make with their podcast and steps on how you can fix them immediately. All right, let's bring Liza on the show. Liza is an incredible real estate expert. She's got an excellent podcast out called 8 Billion. You can check her out at lizaflorida.com and also Liza Florida on Instagram. How are you doing? And thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm doing wonderful, James. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm super excited to be on this podcast and speaking with you guys live.
You've done so many cool things. To give people a bit of an overview, what are you working on now that excites you the most?
Oh, I just finished filming my first documentary film. So if this will give the audience an idea of what podcasting can do for you, I wanted to actually expand on my messaging. And interestingly enough, my podcast isn't based on real estate. It's actually very much on personal development and spirituality. And obviously, with it being called 8 billion, I was like, wow, that is such a huge audience. Like, how am I going to get my messaging out there? I don't know if I can interview 8 billion people. Well, eventually, at the beginning of this year, I had 2 friends that were filmmakers that approached me about doing a documentary film on the indigenous and climate control. And I was able to go back to the motherland, the Philippines, and actually film that just a few weeks ago. So that I'm super excited about.
Wow.
And I'm deep in the middle of season 5D of 8 billion. So the blessings have just been absolutely pouring.
I can only imagine. I mean, I can't even start listing the kind of stuff that have happened to me since I started podcasting in 2013, and it's been such a crazy journey and meeting so many different people. I'm curious to know, being a real estate expert and then deciding to do a podcast on spirituality and personal development, what was that journey like, and what made you do that? And how do you relate that to your business? And how does that come through?
Oh, that's actually a great question. So I have been in real estate for over 20 years, so probably 23. I started at 18 and it was a family business. It was led by my mother. And interestingly enough, I think that back in 2008, we went through the mortgage meltdown, as many of you guys know about, and maybe the audience can remember because it wasn't that far back.
Yeah.
But, it really shot a lot of people into, especially when you kind of lose everything, like money is raining from the sky when real estate's doing well. And then obviously the market crashes and you lose everything, you have to ask deeper questions in life, like what is the real purpose of this? And that's what actually happened. Is I went on a spiritual journey starting in 2008, but obviously it wouldn't take until probably a little over 10 years. I ended up losing my mother in 2018, and that shot me into a deeper spiritual mission. And from there, I just wanted to be of greater service. So I worked in real estate, and then I decided to use 8 billion as my passion project. And here I am, long story short, here I am 5 years, excuse me, uh, what is this? Since my mom passed, 4 years later in season 5. But how do I equate that? It's even people in real estate are on a spiritual journey. And in the beginning, I was, I don't have specifically season 5D is geared towards spirituality. But however, anything prior to that, speakers, anyone and everyone you could think of, because by far, I think the one event that changed stories from all around the world of people either switching gears or just having a better spiritual understanding of who they are now that we've kind of come 2 years from the pandemic. There's been lots of lessons that have been learned, so there's no shortage of stories, I'm telling you that now.
Liza, when you launched your podcast, you launched it so professionally as an interviewer. Your composure, your preparation, all of these different, your connection was so well done. How did you acquire these skills, and what were you focusing on to make? What was happening behind the scenes that enabled you to launch such a professional show without having all of those years of podcasting experience that so many other people have?
Oh, that's even a great question too. So when I, of course, was very deep in my spiritual journey, I knew that I had a calling to do something greater. A lot of people, I am even surprised at in how I was able to deliver it. But what was interesting is I started off live streaming. And live streaming gave me the ability to just be on camera. And even if I made mistakes, there was no way I could correct it. So I ended up live streaming in the summer of 2020, 3 months before I started 8 billion. And I just got over, I think that by the time you start practicing and doing live streams, you just get so comfortable being in front of the camera that it's almost like a conversation that you're having, which in essence it is. It's just like what we're doing right now. Yeah. And with more and more of that practice, that's how I would say that I became prepared to start a podcast, because it was after the success of my live streaming show. Some people were saying, well, have you ever thought about doing a podcast? Because at the time, all my shows were just live. It wasn't recorded. So they were like, at least if you start a podcast, you could, people could watch the replays. And that's what gave me the idea to starting 8 billion.
It's a great it's a great it's a great podcast. It's a great name. I love the name. I love the mission behind what you're trying to do with 8 billion. They say that in business, your business is your personal development journey. Like like when you when you become an entrepreneur, the business throws really cool things your way to grow. Do you feel that has happened to you?
Oh, 1000%. Because I mean, should I already answer the question? What's like a mistake that I already made off the bat with with podcasting? I started a podcast, and I started a podcast thinking it was going to be so easy. I didn't even have my first guest. I started a podcast with my producers. I found some producers here in Orange County. Amazing, it was an amazing team. I did this whole boot camp, created the messaging that I already wanted, all of the design. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to go find out my first podcast guest. So that was really interesting. But here's what I'm saying. Like, I feel that if you have a deep passion to do things, and in most cases, most of the people that are out there that start podcasts have at least done some research. You'll have a few episodes underneath your belt before you launch it. I was running around, but it all ended up working out perfectly. And the thing is, if you just give yourself enough grace and don't judge yourself for the mistakes, then you can actually grow from it. And Ronsley, and that's what you were talking about. It created immense growth for me about just being not so harsh on myself when I did, certain things. I look back on it now and I was like, how did I do it? But you just roll with it, and you just, I think that's one of the things is if you give yourself grace and you don't judge yourself too harshly, you will understand it's just like a career in anything. You learn as you go, and you become better and better as each episode releases, and you learn from the previous seasons.
Yeah, when you remove that self-judgment, you detach that shame that we can feel when we think we might have made a mistake or we're not progressing at the rate we want to progress, which brings me up to this question, Lisa. I mean, on this show, we often talk, Ronsley and I always share every episode one tactic to help people grow and one mistake that people are making that they can correct. You mentioned there the importance of not judging yourself along the way. Out of all your podcasting experience now, is there a particular mistake that you made that you were able to correct that made a big difference, or something in particular that you did that really helped you on that journey that stands out?
Well, here, let me give you an example. Like, many people, once they choose that they want to do a podcast, they will either find a production company or they'll self-produce. I would say that one of the things that I did was I found a production, like producers, and then in season 4 I went and self-produced. So in a way I went almost backwards. However, that ended up being a gift for me because I learned everything on the back end. Like, I learned what I was good at and not good at. And obviously I'm not good at self-producing. So I ended up going back to producers in season 5, and it ended up being better than the first 3 seasons because I knew now like what it took. Like, I knew like like the marketing, what different pieces and assets to make, what how I was going to go about it, how to understand like my numbers and downloads. I didn't count any of that in the beginning, and yet maybe in the first 6 to 8 months, I ended up on like the top 5% in global podcasts on listen notes. So I just want to quote that it's listen notes. I can't say worldwide, but I'm pretty proud of that accomplishment. But beyond anything, like, if you truly find something that you're true passionate about, like, everything kind of works out, and the lessons you learn along the way are incredible.
Yeah, and you bring up a really, like, this conversation brings me to think about this really important point, because we feel these mistakes, we don't want to make these mistakes, right, in public, especially because especially if you're doing a live show, like, what if we make a mistake and everyone sees it? But it's like one of those things where if you don't make the mistake, you don't learn from it. But when you come to doing the podcast, I'm always a huge advocate for learning the procedure behind what happens to the podcast, because what happens to the podcast in the editing phase is really is the host needs to be clued in on how that content comes together, because if the host is not clued in on how that comes together, there's no way for them to make the changes that they require. So I think you've gone through the procedure of doing it yourself, and then when you do it yourself, you kind of know what to tell the producers in the next season. Is that what happened, and what did you instruct them to change when you went back to them?
Absolutely. That's perfect. And it's an amazing question too. Uh, so when I've had my producers for my first 3 seasons, I just want to let the audience know they are different producers than I have for season 5. And when I, even for myself, as I switched out, like, you're absolutely right, Ronsley, there's everything that you need to learn about, like how everything's edited, transcriptions, everything from, like, myself, even when I designed my website, I designed it on Wix. I didn't know that not having it on Word wouldn't allow Google to pick up everything that I was saying.
Yeah.
And so now that I've come across that whole like, I went through that whole self-producing journey, I understood like how important it was for me to have transcriptions. It was important for me to have that all on a Word like website or something that Google would pick up, because by season 5, I've already invested close to 2 years, and a lot of money on this, or,
Yeah.
and it just depends what route you can really do podcasting. You could really do it on a budget, or you can really go all out. And I really want to grow this into a really big global podcast. So I have that better understanding of all the work that goes on behind it, even down to editing, like best timestamp clips, and working with so many different people. It's crazy. Now I just have a team, and it's amazing to be able to do what I do best, which is build these relationships on the podcast and just keep getting my business out there.
How has your life changed as a result of this journey that you've been on now for a few years with the podcasting around access to relationships, stories? Remember the man that we had met at the restaurant as well, who was doing all the work for homeless, Kevin from Skid Row, was that his name?
Yes, in fact, it's dramatically changed my life. I in an odd way, I can't imagine life without this podcast right now. As it's the vehicle which I want, is that's allowing me for my dreams to unfold. Kevin was actually, interestingly enough, my second interview. Until this day, I'm still very good friends with him, and I still do a lot of work with the homeless in Skid Row. So it's expanded all my relationships, not only like locally, but even globally. Like I have everyone from Australia. I think this season 5 is represented, 35 episodes represented with 14 countries for season 5. And I've really like narrowed down like the true message of 8 billion, which is, the elevation of human consciousness. So it's a very spiritual mission.
Yeah, you took the leap to actually get started, and you've made the tweaks and the different pivots, and incorporated all these lessons along the way. Most people don't even take that step to get started. They're busy trying to revise and create this perfect plan before it hasn't even existed. You've got to put it out there in the world to be able to understand exactly what you're dealing with, so you can tweak it. And when social media was first created, the thing and there's obviously a lot of bad things about social media, but one of the things I loved about it was it enabled me to connect and stay connected with people who I might not have seen for 5 years or 10 years. You might have met randomly on a holiday. And with the podcast, I've found that that's a great way to reconnect with people in a deeper, more meaningful way, who you might not have been able to connect with as much as you would want to, but also people out there who you really want to connect with. You're able to have an opportunity to sit down with them for 1 hour, ask them any question you want. If you manage it the right way, like you do, like Ronsley does, and like I do, it opens up the way for an organic friendship to happen, and so many good things and opportunities can come from there.
Yes, absolutely. I fully agree. There's even like a deep healing part of it for me as I started connecting even on a deeper level. And one of the most amazing things that the pandemic did was actually allow us this ability to expand on how we connect with everyone around the world. I don't think that if the pandemic happened or me starting a podcast, I would have met all these people from around the world. And now I feel like if I go somewhere and visit, I could literally just put it out either on my social media. Hey, I'm visiting these places, and I have a place. Like for example, I went to Austin just this last weekend. I went for a conference, but on Sunday I ended up having lunch with someone that I recorded in season 4, and it's just absolutely amazing the expansion that it provides.
It's 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 truly beautiful. I mean, once you talk to the converted about a podcast, we can all get on the same soapbox and talk about how cool it is. I have some crazy stories. I became godfather for the second time because of my podcast, and it's absolutely mental when I start thinking about how I met Leandra. So I feel like these journeys with the podcast not only makes you better in a connection method, because it allows you to ask very interesting questions and understand and be very curious about the person, but it makes you more of an interesting person yourself because of the questions I suppose you land up asking. Do you find yourself growing as a podcast host with every interview that you do? Do you feel the responsibility? Do you feel What is your process before you start an interview? Do you get nervous? Do you have a process before you begin? What's that journey like for you?
Interestingly enough, and I'll share this because it could work both live or prior to podcast. When I first started live streaming, I really took the day to myself to really just ground like my energy and my thoughts and kind of keep to myself. Now, a full day might seem like a lot for some people, but it just depends, because for me, it was something so new. And that's really, I think, where I really developed the skill sets to truly go from live streaming into podcasting. And a big part of that prep is really just feeling comfortable on camera, and then of course being able to be able to ask the right questions that are really interesting, most especially when you've had someone as a guest that's been on multiple podcasts. So that's where it comes in, where James was just saying preparation is always key. And again, like for me, one of the things that I also do to prepare is I still do a pre-podcast interview. So I know that, I know that there's so many different opinions about that, but I like to get that story from that person if I can, so I can build a deeper relationship that once we're on camera or once we're recording, a lot of it just flows. And that's what allows me to put out some really great stories, because I could dig deeper.
Yeah, I'm before James gets in and asks his question, I'd love to like clarify that pre-interview process. How long is it? What kind of questions do you ask? And does anyone not make the cut?
So
Great question.
I'm like thinking about who's on season 5.
Well, Brandon T. Adams failed the pre-interview, so he was unable to go through to the episode.
He didn't make it to season 5. Brandon T.
We love you, Brandon.
Yeah, just that we just won't share this particular podcast with Brandon. No, but Brandon was an amazing mentor who actually introduced me to James, and then that's how we got a podcast. But we were both at his book signing. That's how I think I met James. But are there people for season 5? There were people who didn't make the cut, and here's what was interesting. So when I did my call out, I was very specific, but because of the nature of like how specific I was for this particular season, I was thinking, okay, I'd have like 10 to 15 like inquiries. I did this on Facebook book collaboration, podcast collaboration, excuse me. I had 60 inquiries, and I was like, what am I had 60 emails to read through. But what was really interesting, because of course I was deep and I understood my messaging, I could kind of sift through and kind of understand who I'd want to take into pre-podcast interview from just an email. And what was supposed to only be a 15 episode season ended up being a 35 episode season. So all 35 guests that I interviewed actually made it on. So I was pretty good with screening through email, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting, all these different things. A big part of that, Lisa, before we get into our mistake, I think it's important to try a bunch of different things and find out what works for you. It's true in podcasting, it's true in business, it's true in nutrition, it's true in fitness. It doesn't matter what it is. You've mentioned that there. You went back to try and figure out all the editing and all of these different things after being involved for a little while. For me, doing things like a pre-interview, I don't like doing that, but I respect you and your process enough that gets the finished product that you need. And that's really, really important to do that. So it's just like when it comes to things like preparation, I have my own process that's not going to be, a lot of people will do something very, very differently in terms of even how the finished episode appears. But it's up to you to try a bunch of different things, be aware of a bunch of different things, and then create a process that you have. Let's now go into our mistake, Lisa, and then I'd love to get your thoughts on this. The big mistake for this episode is number 50 on our 70 mistakes. If you want a copy of all 70 mistakes, go to mistakes.wearepodcast.com. And in fact, you will find the 10 biggest mistakes have actions on how to fix them as well. So go to mistakes.wearepodcast.com or comment mistakes below, and we'll send that PDF out to you. Being underprepared for your interview is so bad because you destroy the opportunity of a meaningful relationship before it's even begun. One of the primary reasons that I do my podcast is so I can get access to some of the most influential people in the world and get access to opportunities that come from being connected with those people. And that only comes when you are respectful of those people. And what we'll go through now is a few things to help you do that. My goal when I am doing a podcast interview with a guest is to get a response that's something along the lines of this. You know this subject better than I do. Great question. You've done your research, or just some other acknowledgement that you have gone above and beyond compared to what most podcasters do. Because most podcasters mail it in when they're doing an interview, which just seems crazy to me, as I know it does for Liza and Ronsley as well. I once had a podcast interview where the person is reading my bio, like literally there, like a second before he was about to hit record, asking me what questions do I want to be asked. I mean, I don't have time for this. It's your show. Ask me whatever you want to ask me. I'm here for it. I've turned up, but come on, do your preparation beforehand. And as a result, no real friendship from that one happens. So here is, and I should mention that Keith Ferrazzi, who's a #1 New York Times bestselling author, about 2/3 of the way through the interview, he stopped and he said, James, I just want to acknowledge you because you know this material better than I do, and you are the most prepared podcaster I have ever had an interview with. I'm just not used to it. That's now happened a fair few times, and I think that is about the greatest compliment that you can get as a host of a podcast when you have someone who is an industry expert coming on your show. And Keith is someone who I'd really wanted to connect with for a long time, so that meant a lot to me that he had said that, but it also validated the process that I go through to make sure the preparation is correct through that process. So here is what I do to prepare, and I think that you should be doing this as well, especially when you have recognized people on your show. The very first thing you should do is read their most recent book. You don't have to go on, they might have written a bunch of books. You don't need to read all of them, but at least make sure that you have read their most recent book. I go on Audible. I generally listen to it at about a 1.8 times playback speed so I can get through it very, very quickly. You can rewind the bits that are most impactful or that you want to remember, but that means you're going to have a really clear idea of the subject matter, and you're not going to be asking questions that someone could easily find in the book. The next thing that you could do is listen to 2 podcasts that they have appeared on as a guest. You want to get a feel for the conversation, for how they talk, and in fact, and also what questions they're getting asked on a regular basis. If there is a question that they have been asked, which is going to be along the lines of, what inspired you to do this? What inspired you to do that? Or tell me about your story. These are questions that they've been asked a million times before. They're not going to want to share that with their audience once you send them the finished product. And you're wasting time when you could be asking them questions that show how much you value their expertise and their time. So listening to at least 2 podcasts that they have appeared on is a great way to find out what questions they've been asked most frequently, so you never ask those questions, and you also get a feel for their conversation style. And in fact, when I'm driving to the studio to interview someone, I will listen to a podcast that they have been on in the car, in the real speed, just to get a feel for that flow and the dynamic of what it's going to be like if I've never met that person before. The next bit from there is making sure that you have a question bank. So I have a list of about 20 questions. Ronsley's got an amazing bank, I think, of more than 100 questions that you can draw on if you need to. And what I then do is remove about 80% of those questions that aren't essential, because you don't want to be doing an interview where you ask the exact same questions to different guests every single time, because there's no creativity in your show. So knowing that you have the question bank there that you can apply and adapt to the right guest and remove 80% of the ones that are not relevant or that you don't want to include, and then find out what are the unique questions that you can ask and remove any of the questions that you know that they've been asked before. If you follow that process, you will have an amazing conversation. You will establish or be on a very good path to establishing a really great friendship with them. And when you can provide them with something like video assets at the end, or a really good finished quality of what your episode looks like, they are going to remember that. And it makes it so much easier to move to that next step, which would be getting in each other's phones, so you can send them an audio message or a video afterwards to thank them for coming on the podcast. And that way, once you're in their phone, the sky's the limit in terms of the opportunities that can be created from there. Ronsley, Liza, I've done a lot of talking. What are your thoughts, people?
Well, it's beautiful, right? It's a beautiful way to prepare. You've got actually one of the best tips that you've ever given was on a Clubhouse to go through someone's book. And the tip was you don't have to read the whole book, but read the first paragraph and the last paragraph of every chapter. And I'm like, that's brilliant, because when you write a book, right, the editor does that for you. Always, the chapters are always has the summary at the start and the summary at the end. So it gives you a really good gist in a matter of 10 minutes of reading someone's book, what the book is about. But I want to make this part clear before I get Liza's thoughts. We get Liza's thoughts on this. Preparation for a podcast interview does not mean you prepare to follow it to the book, right? You don't prepare to have a stencil. That is not the idea of preparation. Preparation is so that you do your drills so that when it's game time and the ball appears wherever it appears, you can react in real time. So your preparation allows you to have the most cohesive, most intimate, most connect-worthy conversation. And that is what we're trying to get here. We're not trying to make you a robot. We're not trying to give you a bunch of questions that you repeat all the time, but we're trying to make you as a better host so that you are in the moment, you find your flow, and you're able to respond in a way that the guest goes, wow, that is a great conversation. I love this. Because when you have a great conversation, it's psychology. Your serotonin levels go up. You feel great. You get new energy. You feel that. And every podcast host will know this, that when they have a bad interview, their energy gets drained. When they have a good interview, they feel like they can do another 10. So I love that list on how to prepare. Liza, keen to get your thoughts.
Oh, you gentlemen, everything you guys have said actually on point. And it's interesting, James, that you said that, because by the time I got maybe a few episodes in, and then of course my mentor and coach Brandon T. Adams, he's getting quite a few shout outs here. It was all about having a well prepared. I do exactly that. If I can't read the whole book, I skim through some of like the best things, or at least chapters I'm really interested in. I'll skim through the YouTube and find, do a search on them, watch anything that they, as much as I can, either podcast interviews or watch, because in some cases they're TEDx speakers. So that I do that. I set up and you saw this, James. I had my set of questions. But what's really neat is once you start becoming very comfortable as a podcaster, you can literally take that question and you could roll through as a great conversation. And those are those what do you call those? The key things to remember as you become more comfortable as a podcaster. You'll start to know, like what Ronsley said, to be able to pivot in those moments, because you're literally recording, and to have the best professional setup. If I have like an opening guest and they've got quite an audience, I do go off site to actually record in a studio, one that James and I recorded in, and then everything from beginning to end, and like even providing assets of that. Now my producers do it. They send the blog post, they send assets that they can use. It's all there. They send another email following a week later, because sometimes they're not able to post and share immediately. I mean, everything from beginning to end is really going to make a difference in how your podcast is going to be viewed, either by, of course, like your guest and of course your audience and the experience that they're going to have. But yes, definitely spot on. And one more thing that I would like to say, you were absolutely right. Preparation is key. And James, you did say, like, for you don't prefer pre-podcast interviews, specifically for season 5, only because I'm having people tell me their stories. I went through the process of actually giving them half an hour to an hour to tell me their stories, because sometimes they can really go off. And at least when I was recording the podcast, I could keep them on point and get the messaging to where I wanted to go. Because if not, then I'd be like recording an hour and listening to them. So that just for some people, for preparation, in some cases, depending on what your subject matter is, was my reason for doing preparation, or like pre-podcast interviews for season 5.
And there are some people out there who have incredible stories, but they're just not public. And that's where an example like a pre-interview would be really, really powerful and important. So that's great. And Ronsley, what you mentioned before, the distinction of rigidity versus being in flow for the interview. You and I know this, Rons, because we've spoken about it in the past, but I'm very guilty of over preparing to such an extent that I was too rigid with the questions and things that I had on there. It's something for the last 18 months I've really tried to get a lot better at. And I feel like I'm in that mode now, like Liza just shared there, where you rock up, you've prepared so much. And I've also been in some situations recently where, because having two kids now, I don't have as much time as I would like. And it's easy for your day to be derailed or your week to be derailed, where you mightn't have the luxury of time to prepare as much as you would like. So you find yourself in an interview where you have no option but to go with the flow a little bit more. You're still prepared because you know a lot about their story, but you haven't had the time to be able to craft a full list of questions for the story that you want to map out. And I've actually realized that some of the best conversations and some of the best interviews have come from that, because you're totally present and with what the person's saying, rather than focusing on what your next question is going to be. And if you find yourself as an interviewer where the person you're talking to or you're interviewing says to you, "What was the question again?" And if you're thinking about the next question rather than what they're saying, then you're like, "Oh shit, how did I find myself in this situation?"
Yeah, it's being in the moment in an interview is probably the hardest thing that a podcaster has to learn. And that's the big difference going from a business owner to a podcaster. And I feel most business owners feel like they can just start a podcast, and they can just start a podcast, but they have to get the reps in to be a great host. And to be a great host, like you've been to parties where the host is just shit, right? And that is what we experience on podcasts, but it's just a different way to put it. So be a great host, be welcoming, be hospitable, make your guest comfortable, make them want to share their life, their story, their thoughts, their ideas, stuff they've probably never even thought of before with you. And for that to happen, you've got to make them comfortable. For them to be comfortable, they've got to know that you care. For you to care, you've got to be prepared. So that's the process to be a really good host on a podcast, I suppose.
What a tie-in. I feel like that's a mic drop moment there, Ronsley. I think that's also good timing to continue into our tactic for today. Ronsley, what have you got for us? Something special?
Well, what happens when you have a podcast is we start to blur the lines between the different stages of creating the podcast. So we kind of think, okay, we have a podcast, we've got to put an episode out, and we bunch that together as one task. So I want to break this up for you, because what Liza mentioned, amazingly enough, because she's doing it in a season type format, she is doing these stages consciously, because she is doing it in a season format. But this way of doing your podcast needs to be applied even when you're doing a continuous interview style show that you're releasing every week or every fortnight or whatever your frequency is. These 7 stages of publishing your podcast are key, because it allows you to separate the process and not bunch them together. So what are the 7 phases? Maybe they are here. So I drew a little diagram so you understand what they are. The first phase is prep. Now, we've covered the prep part of this. So this is like if you're doing an interview, which most of business owners, I suggest doing an interview style format, because it allows you to build these relationships along the way. It allows you to create a podcast that becomes a great business development tool. So the first stage is prep. Now, if you're not doing an interview style show, but you're doing a subject matter and maybe a solo show, then even then prep is required. So that is the first step. You do your prep for your episode. This is each episode, right? So the first step is do your prep. The second step is go out and do the recording. So you separate the recording phase from your publishing phase. So right now, what we're doing here in this show is recording. right? This recording gets taken, it gets edited down, and it gets put into a podcast in a more consumable format where we remove things that don't need to be in there. So it becomes more consumable for a business owner who wants to grow their podcast, grow their listeners, get new clients, leverage their podcast. All that happens in a more concise format after the recording. So we record. The next stage is editing. Now, this is a very important phase because you would never read a blog post that's not edited. You would never read a book that's not edited. You would never read an article that's not edited. Why do you think someone's going to listen to a podcast that is not edited? Right? And editing comes in different ways. If you just remove ums and ahs, that's like you doing a spell check. If you rearrange your content, that is what book editors do. That's what you do in a blog post so that it's more consumable for your listener to consume. So after you record, you go to the step 3, which is edit, which is removing things that are not required. Step 4 is after the editing is done, you put all of that together, your intro, your call to action, your call to engagements. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go to a couple of episodes before. We talk about what the building blocks of a binge-worthy podcast. I cover what is call to actions, engagements, and subject matter in that. So look at a previous episode for that. Step 4 is creating the MP3 file from which is the final MP3 file, which you make all your content reusable from there. Step 5 is making all the repurposing. So you create all your social posts, your blog posts, your whatever from this MP3 file that is fully edited and it's like ready to go, and you create all your social pieces from there. Step 6 is finally publishing that MP3. So you put that out and now the MP3 is published and your podcast is out live. Once it's out live, you finally go to step 7, which is marketing. And now if you spend, we spoke about this in a previous mistake, if you spend 20% of your time doing these activities, you have to spend 80% of your time marketing your podcast. And it's not only time, it is money. So if you spend $100 doing that, you've got to spend $400 at least marketing. So reduce the money you spend here so you can spend more money here, because that is where you get the growth for your each episode. So that is the 7 stages to publishing your podcast. Make sure you separate them so that you don't clunk them together. And I'm keen to hear what you all think of that, because I feel like Liza does this unconsciously because of the seasons that she goes through, or maybe consciously because of the season that she goes through. But we don't really think of this as much as continual hosts, podcast hosts that produce episodes every week, because we think, okay, I've got to do a show now, let me interview someone and then do it this week, put it all out this week, and it becomes this rush. But if you have the recordings done, which I think James is just onto that in 2022, it makes life a whole bunch easier. Hey.
Yes.
Huge. Yeah, Lisa, how does that feel for you? Anything that lands in particular from there?
Oh, you guys, is it my turn, guys?
If you've got any thoughts, Ron's when it comes to sort of editing and putting all those things together, you listen to one of his podcasts and I'm like, wow, I don't usually get that much imposter syndrome. I listen to one of Ronsleys' podcasts and I'm like, oh, damn, he's good. He's so good at like all the audio stuff, things I don't even understand. So yeah, it's great.
No, absolutely. If I can chime in, gentlemen, that is, if I had those 4 stages when I began, instead of like looking for them, I can only imagine where my podcast is, because those are the 7 stages. And you're absolutely right, Ronsley. Marketing should be your biggest budget, because that's what gets your podcasts out there. So I am formally like in that stage now of really creating this budget so I can expand. And this is great to the audience. If anyone is listening, whether you're going to start a podcast or you're in the middle of it, this is exactly what I went through in 5 seasons. And the reason that I do have a break is just, or seasons, is to give a break. And now I personally believe in batching. Mine is just because it's not time sensitive. Mine is, like I'm able to put a client, or a guest out there in 7 months from now, and would still be, unless of course we're trying to at the same time trying to launch it with the either any of their offerings or a book launch. Other than that, my podcast is not specific to it's not time sensitive. But all of those things that you brought up is amazing.
Yeah, batching when it comes to consistency in particular. Consistency of having the podcast released and then consistency of social media to promote. They are two absolutely fundamental things that people need to get good at. If you can't master consistency, then all bets are off in terms of being able to build a loyal following, as we've spoken about on Podcasting for Business before. And what was I going to say? Batch producing episodes. I mean, it's huge. Even as I get more and more in the podcast game, I'm just putting more and more value on even having like 4 months worth of episodes in the bank, just to release that stress and allow that whole process behind the scenes to unfold.
Yeah, it's huge. It allows you to be a better business owner if you're prepared and you're batched and you're putting your content out regularly. You have a process for that, but it should not hinder your process, your capabilities of being a business owner because you have a podcast. So these stages allow you to have all this plate spinning, I suppose, that all business owners have.
Absolutely. Well, this has been such a phenomenal show. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on. You can learn more about Lisa at her website, lisaflorida.com, and also connect with her on Instagram. She's doing some incredible things with the world. So, Lisa, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure being on this show.
So cool.
And if you want to join us for episode 12 of Podcasting for Business, we're bringing on Byron Dempsey, who's the founder of Driven Young. His podcast has got more than 1 million downloads. He's got more than 50 million likes on TikTok. He's absolutely crushing it. He's a great guy. He's going to share a lot of tips with us as well. So Podcasting for Business, episode 12 is coming up in 48 hours. If you would like a copy of our 10 biggest mistakes and how to fix them, go to mistakes.wearepodcast.com. And remember, our big announcement from the last episode was that we're doing in-person events again, 10th and 11th November in Australia. It's going to be absolutely massive. I will be flying back for it. It's going to be great. And I probably shouldn't mention this, but we're doing like an invite-only LA event for Ronsley flying over to America. So anyone who's in LA on the 8th of July, we have some incredible things planned to show you how to get more listeners, more clients, and more credibility using your podcast. Ronsley and Lisa, so great to see you. And everyone else, we'll see you on the next episode of Podcasting for Business.
See you, team.